Well, I did a mix when I was planning these in August. I asked members of the congregation what topics that they would like to see people talk about and discuss. And then I also had some people I knew I wanted to talk to, and I asked them, you know, here's some ideas, here's some things that people are asking about, but also, is there anything that you want to talk about in particular? And you were one who had a really clear answer, talking about all the things that have changed and kind of how we can build our capacity for flexibility and resilience and safety in the face of all that. So I guess just to get into it, you know, maybe tell us a little bit about why that was so on your mind. Are there big things that have changed for you personally since all of this, everything started? Like, are there places that you've had to be flexible or call on resilience?
Yeah. Yes to all of that. I'm just kind of trying to come up with a mental index of what that looks like without taking you too far down into the rabbit hole. And in that, actually, I don't think I'm different from almost everyone else I know. I think that the biggest difference in terms of both heading towards resilience and also the flexibility necessary in order to do so is in relationship. I know you talked with Bev about relationship last week. You know, professionally, my entire job, ministry, yes, but even more in terms of psychotherapy, because that's where most of my professional life is right now, is in terms of building relationships with people, and just recognizing that the dimensions of what that looks like on a regular basis. You know, I've worked with people, I've completed full courses of treatment with folks who I will never meet in real life. And that requires an awful lot of recognizing the typical ways, or the ways, I don't want to say typical, the ways I was used to building relationships with people in a professional way, you know, needed to adapt to, you know, a form of what you and I are doing right now. And then there's the personal side to it, just people who I'm used to seeing on a regular basis in real life, in the flesh. That's not happening, or if it's happening outside, masked, distanced, and all the other permutations of how we can relate to each other, which is something else that you mentioned, you know, how to relate and cultivate a sense of safety and connection.
I was thinking about that today. I have plans tomorrow to see a friend for lunch, and we're doing something that now has become our standard way of getting together. It's my friend Sarah, but it's so absurd when I think about it. We go down to the pier and we sit outside and bring our own lunches, and we're sitting outside by the river, like on this abandoned pier behind a Walmart in South Philadelphia. And it's like, when would that have ever been the chosen way that we would get together? But now it hits all the boxes. You know, it's not crowded, it's outside, there's actually a nice view, so there's some perks to it. But you know, what an example of a way that things have changed.
And that's the resilience and adaptability angle, which is, you know, if we can give ourselves permission to, you know, accept, mourn, grieve, rage, whatever we need to do, to be in that place of recognizing how much has changed. If we, I think, allow that work in and allow ourselves to experience those kinds of feelings, then I think that opens up additional space to be able to find yourself, you know, in South Philly behind a Walmart on the river, enjoy in the best way and safest way you can lunch with a friend.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you talked about building relationships with people that you haven't even met in person, I've noticed in the last couple months, for anybody who doesn't know, you're a minister and you're also a psychotherapist and a clinician. And a lot of my friends are ministers, and I know a handful of people who've started new ministries in August. You know, that's the typical time of the year when a minister will go into search in the spring, get a new job, and typically pick up and move and start serving a new congregation in the fall. And I know all of these ministers who didn't move because they didn't have to. And they are serving congregations of people they have never met in person. They've only gotten to know them this way, or through Zoom, or through email. I mean, it's wild, the things that it makes possible for us, but it takes so much away, like you said, of the things we used to be able to rely on, to take the temperature of a room, to read somebody's full body language, to see how people move together in a space. It's one of the things I miss about Sunday morning. You know, I feel like I could tell a lot about how people were doing from how they walked in the door on Sunday. And we don't have that anymore, you know?
Yeah, our kind of somatic cues with each other are off and also narrowed. I mean, you know, I feel as if I'm studying faces has become such a fascinating way to relate to people, and we do that anyway all the time as human beings. But you know, faces that we cannot see the rest of their bodies, that's the piece that I think, you know, we talk about all the adaptability of learning how tech happens, of learning what it's like to shut down a Facebook Live event, you know, and okay, this is what we do, unplug it, plug it back in. But from kind of the neurobiological perspective of seeing faces without bodies on a regular basis, I think it's going to take a lot longer for that to catch up in terms of that being, to some core part of us, kind of still feeling destabilizing, even though we're all getting a lot more experience at it right now.
Yeah. So is that part of what makes it, let me back up. What are the things that you think are making it even harder for us to be resilient this year? Or be flexible with the changes?
It's kind of these like two categories that I see a lot in my own life, but I'm seeing a lot in other folks as well too, which is like vastly, wildly overstimulated by all the new learning and all the adaptation required, and then really wildly understimulated. You know, if this was Goldilocks, there'd be a lot of like too hard and too soft, you know, too cold and too hot. And so finding that sense of like what's balance, where's the equipoise in the middle, I think is kind of the core challenge that I see. And I mean, we see it I know some folks, their professional lives are kind of going gangbusters. They have too much work to do. There is too much stimulation. They need more hours in the day. And then for some folks, the exact opposite problem, which is, you know, the opportunities for work, meaningful or otherwise, have dried up. And of course, that brings a whole bunch of other stresses and vulnerabilities as well, too. So it's like, what does or what can enough look like in this time? And to be able to kind of find the balance between the too much and the too little is such a chronic challenge that I see myself working with, and not always that well. And I see a lot of other people struggling with too.
Yeah, I mean, we're missing a whole bunch of choices we would normally have. Between too hot and too cold, there's a whole range of things that I guess we just don't have access to. Yeah.
And I think that's where the opportunities come in with, you know, how do we regulate our own emotional responses to that? I think that's where a lot of the work is. Where do we set those boundaries as effectively as we can? How do we ground ourselves, connect ourselves in the most meaningful ways that feel sustainable? And I think that's the, you know, if there's an opportunity here, that's what I see in terms of how we can cultivate certain states of being that allow a kind of sustainable, you know, not resilience in the form of bouncing back to what was, which I think is a very narrow understanding of resilience, but more about the kind of adaptable sense of resilience. You know, how do we grow into the challenges of this time, recognizing that certain of our buttons are going to be pushed over and over again when it comes to the chronic, different but chronic kinds of stress that we're experiencing, depending upon, you know, what we do for a living, where our lives are, the amount of you know, social marginalization that we live with, those kinds of things. So it's like the, you know, all in the same storm, but not in the same boat kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, how do we do that then? It sounds like you have some things in mind. Is there a way that we can practice or grow our capacity for resilience, even though so much around us is limited?
So this is both a personal and professional kind of core for me, and has been. And long before I did these forms of work has been, I would say, kind of the long haul work of my life, which is cultivating within myself and encouraging others to cultivate the most compassionate form of ourselves. And by compassion, I mean, like, you know, different than empathy. Empathy is obviously a really important tool, that, you know, capacity to, you know, sense what someone else is thinking and feeling. But by compassion, I mean a much more specific understanding. And I'm not quoting from anything I made up. This is the Dalai Lama there's this kind of sense of real caring about our own or another's suffering, and also the willingness to take steps to alleviate that suffering. And so there's both a kind of attitudinal quality of warmth and caring, and also then there's a commitment to wanting to be effective in terms of how we respond to suffering particularly. And so that's what I notice myself going to within myself when I am regularly kind of bumping up against my own self-created walls, or the walls and the barriers that are just a part of this time of being alive. And it's what I see very often in the lives of my clients as well too. And sometimes those barriers create so much suffering, and not like self-imposed suffering, like the kind of suffering that emerge out of incredibly unfair social circumstances. And at the same time, given how objective these challenges are, I think it throws into even more relief. How can we be invited to cultivate that sense of caring about our own and other suffering in the most effective way possible? And so that's, that for me leads towards a more skillful understanding of resilience, rather than just the kind of pure bouncing back, or things are fine, or we can get back to what was. Rather, which to me actually then plays into a perpetuation of certain kinds of suffering for people. Either an externalization of that in terms of recognizing, well, if only I could get back to what was, and you need to stop standing in my way, then I will be okay. And then I think there's the other aspect of really cultivating a sense of warmth. When the frustrations are mounting and are so many in our culture right now. I'm very far from the first person to identify these kind of qualities of harshness and cynicism that are in the culture. And I don't even want to argue with whether the harshness or the cynicism is deserved at times. I think we can, I'll personalize it. I know I can come up with all kinds of reasons to kind of verify that harshness or that cynicism or that suspicion of folks' motives. And so I'm less interested in judging that to be right or wrong, and more, I think the more compelling question is, what's the skillful way to be with those feelings so that I'm continuing to open up to my own or other folks' suffering in a way that I might be a part, or encourage other people to be a part of alleviating that suffering and that very real struggle.
Mm-hmm. You talked about that feeling of being in the moment where you're hitting up against a limit, you're hitting up against the lack of an option that you used to have, and feeling like, why are you standing in my way? Externalizing that, being angry about it. What does the alternative look like in the moment? Or is there a, yeah, I was going to say, is there a practice or something that triggers a different way of responding to that?
Mm-hmm. I think this is where the somatic awareness is particularly important. I mean, the first capacity of wanting to change anything is really noticing in the first place what we're working with. And while the mind is really good at time traveling and kind of bringing the old stories into the current, and again, that's not always wrong. I mean, this is how we understand patterns in life, or leaping forward, which also is not wrong in and of itself, to anticipate where we might be headed. When that becomes the habitual response, the one place where where I notice I'm not, is in being here right now, and the capacity to be able to kind of tune into our bodies in that moment, and to be able to see, like, have my shoulders are they starting to do this thing? Mm-hmm. Is my heart doing a little bit more pitter pat? Is my breath really shallow? And to see those not as wrong or bad responses, but as physiological responses to stress, and as perhaps the very beginning of a cue or an invitation to ask, how can I bring a sense of warmth and caring first to my own experience? And if I'm able to do that, then maybe that holds out the hope that I will be more skillful in responding to other folks' stress, sorrow, sadness, longing, I mean, all the versions of suffering that are showing up right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know we talk a lot at WellSprings, and I imagine this might come into your clinical work too. I'm curious if it does, how you work with people around that in a culture where we're so removed from our bodies, you know, where most people probably don't even know what the word somatic meant when you first said it, right? That perhaps with the exception of athletes and dancers, right? People who are trained to really be in touch with their bodies. And that says a lot too, that in our American society, it's, if you do it for work, maybe you're trained to be in touch with your body, right? But for the rest of us, we spend so much time in our heads trying to think through things, and we spend so much time in thinking about our emotions, I think, rather than checking in with our bodies and knowing how to do that even in the moment. Do you see that being true when you work with people clinically?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly where a lot of the teaching and guiding and facilitating component of the work really come into importance, which is, you know, we're so used to being prescriptive about our bodies and about life itself. This is what we should be doing, or this is what ought to happen. And sometimes we're exactly right about that. And it is kind of a cultural bias, especially if we have certain forms or are used to certain forms of privilege or control. Where we will first immediately go to, this is what I can do to deal with this. And there's an aspect of flipping that on its head in which I'll ask people to just first simply describe before they prescribe. You know, this is what's happening right now. Working within a mindfulness frame, which shows up in my own personal practice, shows up in my ministry, shows up in my clinical work. We talk about this triangle of awareness between thoughts, feelings, and sensations. And that sometimes identifying any one of those can be a challenge for folks. And so if, like, well, okay, I'm feeling really triggered, I'm having difficulty finding the words for this. What are you noticing in the body? Or maybe the body's gone a little bit numb in that moment, and we can start to find some languaging around the emotions. And then we can kind of gently guide back into, especially if it's what feels like a safe inquiry with the person. I mean, safety is the foundation of all of this, right? If it's a safe inquiry, and if we can get a kind of foothold with one of those points of the triangle, very often what I see is that the other points of the triangle start to come online, and we start to be able to see this connection, this interdependence, or to use the fancy Buddhist term, the kind of the co-arising, you know, of what it's like when, you know, as my shoulders start to come up, and I may not even have been aware of it a moment ago. Well, okay, as we start to notice that and maybe soften with it a little bit, what thoughts were coming up then? I'm starting to feel like maybe I didn't have an answer. Maybe it's not all right to have an answer. And the emotion that it brings up is fear, or a sense of inadequacy, or shame. I mean, that could go a whole host of ways with people. And this is the aspect where, regardless of what, you know, personal or professional dimension I'm in my life, this is why, you know, first and foremost, being a mindfulness practitioner is what qualifies me to be able to do any of that kind of interacting with folks, is that I first have to be familiar of that kind of experience, that unfolding of experience within myself. So yay for having, I posted about this yesterday for those of you who are Facebook friends of mine, that, you know, I completed this 52 weeks of going to this particular spot in the Schuylkill River, hashtag watching the river flow, and hashtag week, whatever number it was. And, you know, I did that a year ago, well before, you know, 6 months before the pandemic was here. And, like, I mean, thank God, because that was such a steadying thing to have to turn to. And to me, that's the value of any spiritual practice, is to allow it to be such a regular aspect of our lives, so that when the bottom drops out or we find ourselves really afraid or scared or ashamed, or whatever kind of disturbing mind and mood state there is, we have a container, a practice to be able to hold that, so that we're able to begin in whatever ways we can, begin to work with it as helpfully as we can.
Good work, past Kim, in starting that, right?
I do thank him, and actually that's I don't we could head into it right now, but you probably have some other questions. But this kind of building of this different parts of ourselves, the past, the present, the scared part of ourselves, the compassionate part of ourselves. This is actually really all part of the work, and the different techniques or practices that we can build over time, and strengthen ourselves in this capacity to be able to recognize when, like, we enter into a fear state, or when we start to notice that we're telling certain stories about ourselves or about other people, especially when that storytelling emerges out of real stress reactions. It's real easy for all of us as human beings to have that define all of our experience in the moment. You know, that like Bev talked about this last week. You know, certain way of talking about it is the either or, you know, quote unquote black or white thinking, in which, you know, the words we can look for is it's always this way, or it's never this way. It's the everything nothing kind of dichotomy. And if we are committed to kind of cultivating this compassionate sense of ourselves, even the presence of those always or never, everything nothing, rather than being signs that we're failing at something, can become the very compassionate cues to say, oh, you know, here's a chance to drop into the practice right now, rather than bringing, you know, additional judgment to that we effed up again, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm noticing that I'm telling the story that I'm always like this, or I always screw up, which is oh, right. That word reminds me that that's not true. Like just the fact of noticing it. Yeah. I've been reading a lot of these articles about how to prepare for this winter. And that was one of the frameworks that one of the, I guess it was a podcast I was listening to, actually. I think it's NPR's Life Kit was talking about kind of how to prepare for the next few months. And that was one of the frameworks that this woman, this author, put on it. Think about what future you will be happy you've done. You know, think about what gifts you can kind of give to future you. And, you know, if that seems like a weird way to think about it, she's like, you've probably had those experiences where you've done something and you've been like, oh, wow, I'm really glad past me thought about this, or, you know, set this up for me, or made that choice, or kept that friendship. You know, those ways of thinking about the past and the future. It sounds like what you're saying is, you know, that's a way of practicing compassion, rather than, well, I don't know, am I saying it right? Rather than getting caught in thinking about the past or the future, or controlling the future, or blaming ourselves for the past, that we can kind of hijack that same system for compassion.
Yeah, it is kind of a mind hack. It's interesting you kind of brought up that form of talking about it. Because I think that is the challenge when we have these kind of disturbing mind, mood, feeling states, is that, you know, as the kind of, if you've ever seen the model of the hand, you like to flip your lid, like, you know, when our thinking and reasoning mind goes offline, and all we're left with is like the fight or flight parts of the brain, and like the old, sometimes very painful memories. Having that capacity to ground ourselves and then think of this as a part of our experience. And that's what the variation, as I heard you saying, of like the past part of me, the future part of me, rather than this is all of me right now, which tends to be associated with not a lot of, the opposite of flexibility, right? A lot of sometimes rigidity in terms of our self-conception, and doesn't leave as much room for both the kind of cognitive flexibility, but also sometimes the physical flexibility. It's one of the reasons that, you know, my mindfulness training included some basic yoga skills. And so that's one of the things I work on with folks, both, when I was involved in WellSprings with the Mindful Recovery Group, which I'm just so excited to see that that's like gone on and continues to be such a thriving part of the community of WellSprings. Like, you know, the foundation of that group, the way we would enter that space is by doing 20 minutes of very basic mindful movement with each other. And what I tend to see, and echoing back to what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, is that kind of when we can be in the body in that way, it then opens up the capacity to regain perspective upon our experience. And it's like, it's the difference between like, you know, having a thought like, you know, like I'm a loser, or I suck, or what's wrong with me. And then we can start to battle about that. Like we start, I'm having judgment about how much I suck. And then I'm
so bad at judging myself for how much I suck. Yeah.
And then we can have guilt or shame about our judgment, about our fear. I mean, and we can go down all these rabbit holes. And so rather than even contesting those judgments, if we can take a thought like, I suck, or why am I such a loser? Oh, I did it again, or I had a relapse. What's wrong with me? Or I got angry at my spouse or my kid again. If we could take that thought instead of it being right here, I mean, because, you know, literally, just if you just answer the question, Lee, like what can I see right now?
Just that thought. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can't see the rest of my life. And so, like, if I could take that thought and kind of change my relationship with it a little bit, and like, there's all forms of different ways to do it. And this isn't a psycho-ed conversation, but like, you know, Brene Brown popularized one of the best of them, which is, I notice I'm telling myself the story that.
Mm-hmm.
And
the story I'm telling myself right now. Yeah.
And if we can do that, then that's a way of kind of taking that story, I'm a loser, out here. Mm-hmm. And that story can still be there, but then maybe we might recognize, like, we have a friend we could reach out to, or I can do some yoga, or I can validate myself a little bit in that moment. And again, it reduces that sense of, this is all of me. This is the totality of who I am in this moment. Only the negative thought, self-judgment, or shame, anger, whatever it is. And it makes it apart. And then other aspects of ourselves can come online, or they can be brought into the conversation. And we feel less bereft or kind of cast adrift.
It's funny, as we're talking, the question that keeps coming up for me is, why are we so bad at being compassionate with ourselves? And that might be a way bigger question. That, I mean, I don't know if you have thoughts on it, but it also occurs to me as I'm thinking about it that it's maybe part of letting ourselves off the hook is not worrying too much about that question, right? That we can talk about why something is, but perhaps it's more useful for us to just... Well, I learned something today, which is that I need to make sure that I put my phone on Do Not Disturb, or else I'll get a phone call in the middle of my Facebook Live.
Hi there.
Hey! Oh my gosh, I didn't turn on Do Not Disturb on my phone. Oops.
How can you meet that mistake with compassion?
We're all 20% stupider right now. My new favorite phrase. People make mistakes, and I'm a person too.
There we go. Mm-hmm. Little classic validation. Yeah. I think the question you were asking before we got interrupted was, why are we so bad at this? You know, or why is it so difficult? Why is it such a challenge?
Yeah.
That's and sorry, you may have been answering that when I got disconnected, so I don't want to interrupt.
No, you go.
That's actually something I spend a lot of time talking about my clients with, and providing some basic psychoeducation around that can be really valuable. And it has to do with kind of how human beings evolved and how we developed over thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And I don't want to go into all that, but basically is the theory, and this is by a guy named, it's Richard, I'm blanking on his name. He's an English fellow, Richard Gilbert, I think, but we can put that in later. But he's the founder of what's called compassion-focused therapy. And he has this theory that we have three systems for emotional regulation. One is the drive system, associated with wanting and desire and food and shelter and sex and, like, you know, the basic things that human beings need to keep alive, which if your ancestors and my ancestors didn't have, we would be having this conversation.
Right. We wouldn't be here.
And it's exactly. And it's, you know, this is where like the brain chemistry associated is like dopamine. You know, we get something we really want, we get a hit of dopamine, which means we can want even more of it. And this is where we can wind ourselves up with challenges if we're not careful with it. But we need this drive system. We also have a threat system, which is associated with fear and anger and disgust. Again, we need a fear system. You know, the joke, and people immediately get it. Not only is that funny a joke, but it's clear. It's you know, if in an age of a pandemic, if we didn't have a fear system, we'd go around like licking strange doorknobs and stuff. Like, you know, just to make it kind of particularly kind of gross and relevant.
Or discuss system. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. If we didn't have that, again, we wouldn't survive. Why are we not so good at self-compassion? It tends to be because there's another system that we also have as human beings that often goes missing, especially when we're chronically stressed, especially when we're struggling. And that's what we call the soothing system. And in that system, we're not so much looking for safety from threat or danger. We're looking for the safeness of human connection. Soothing is often thought of as like a quality of warmth. And so is really related to this capacity to be able to turn towards our suffering and to bring the soothing system kind of connection, warmth towards ourselves, caring about ourselves in relationship and in balance with the drive system and the threat system, both of which, of course, have a role to play as well, too.
And I guess if I think more deeply then about how we are not so naturally predisposed to compassion, when I think about the influences we see on our screen and, you know, the way products are advertised to us and the way our economy runs, you know, it runs on hijacking so much the third one, not cultivating that third system.
Mm-hmm. And you're kind of pixelated on me, so I'm wanting to leave enough space and room so I can make sure you're done speaking and not interrupting.
I'm done.
Yeah, I mean, I identified it. There's a whole economy built on wanting and fearing. And what it is, however, to enter into what are less commodified, which is the capacity to relate in a way, again, not safety from threat, but the safety. And so this is a lot of the work that I do with folks in terms of like recent or challenges with safeness with other people. Can we think of a friend? Can we think of a pet? Can we think of, even if the person isn't real? I mean, it's amazing how many people, Rogers, as like someone who connotes that sense of safeness and acceptance. And so we'll start to describe, well, what's it like when you're even within your head in the presence of someone, friend, pet, whomever, who sense of safeness, relating it all the way back to where we started. People often start to talk about like, okay, my attention feels more flexible, feels more open. I notice that my emotions are not associated with wanting to remove something that feels dangerous to me. I find myself becoming more curious. I find that my body posture kind of naturally opens. It is like going from a this kind of defensive posture, which again, sometimes we need as human beings because sometimes our lives are under threat, to a capacity for this. Kind of broad across the collarbones, open. And again, in this state, it's a lot easier to breathe. And so this is what we talk about with building the soothing system or building the capacity for our compassionate, which we can then bring to the parts of ourselves that are, you know, the chronically sad parts of ourselves, or the part of ourselves that judges us, or the part of ourselves that is afraid to try new things because we rehearse in our brains over and over again all the times that we failed in the past. And rather than contesting that story, we can notice it and ask, how can we bring the warmth, the compassion, the caring about it? And in many ways, these practices are built off some centuries, if not thousands. Actually, compassion-focused therapy is very the debt that it holds to certain forms of Buddhist meditation. And like within the certain Buddhist scriptures, there's the image of, I like to say a loving parent. And again, for some people, they don't have loving parents, so that image doesn't work for them at all. So we'll talk about a friend. But in the classic Buddhist scriptures, they'll talk about like a loving mother being with a child who they really care about, and that child is sick or suffering, and that parent is really with them. This is the kind of self that we're looking to help people. I'm looking to help people kind of cultivate and build within themselves when they recognize that the kind of drive system or the threat system is kind of gone out too much, and the soothing system is kind of feeling left behind.
When we talk about compassion, I think most of the conversation about compassion is wrapped up in society and in how we treat other people. In these times when there are so many limits around us, when so much is changing, when so much is hard, it sounds like you're also talking about compassion as maybe doing both at the same time, having a positive effect on how we are with other people, but also actually benefiting ourselves. How do you feel like practicing compassion actually benefits each of us as well?
Yeah, and sorry, you're still a little pixelated, so I think I got most of what you were saying.
Okay.
So I'm going to pick up on the part that I think I heard you say. So both experientially, but also what kind of all the research tells us is that our capacity to cultivate a sense of self-compassion naturally leads to and connections with compassion for other people. It's the difference between like building a sense of self-esteem, which is not like bad or wrong necessarily, but self-esteem tends to be those psychological aspects that kind of has us feeling greater than or lesser than, like heading back into that ranking social order stuff that tends to cause a lot of suffering. Whereas self-compassion is a way of, I would say, building more equitable human relationships. And so like when someone like Kristen Neff, who's one of the foremost teachers and researchers about self-compassion, talks about self-compassion having three primary components. Being in the moment, being able to describe what's going on, being able to relate to our experience in a non-judgmental way. That being kind of one leg of the three-legged stool. The second being kindness. What is it like to treat ourselves with kindness when we're suffering? What is it like to, curl up with a warm animal or call a friend or just sometimes place a hand on the heart and kind of feel our own heartbeat and, do something kind for ourselves. The third component is what's called common humanity, which is most explicitly the bridge with other people. You did it before. Like, I made a mistake. People make mistakes. I'm not the worst person in the world. This is a common thing that happens to folks. I think this is such an important part as well, as someone who works with so many people with substance use disorders, of like recovery or sober support relations, that we recognize the basic fact that we're not alone. And even if what we have done has been harmful to ourselves or to other people, the capacity to have a place to bring that up and share that with others who will understand and accept is a core aspect of kind of creating that bridge of remembering that we're not in it on our own.
Yeah.
We're not immediately disqualified from belonging to the human race.
Yeah. Which is often how we feel in those moments. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you can even hear me, hopefully you can. I know my connection is apparently not as good after starting this new one, but I noticed we're about 5 minutes till when you have to stop. So for anybody who's watching, if you all have questions or if there's anything that you want to share about your experience that relates to what we're talking about, you can type it into the comments in the bottom left, and we'll be able to see it before we go and answer any questions that you have. Ken, as you think about looking ahead, 2020 is not over yet, unfortunately. We still have at least, as things continue to change around us and in ways, what do you think are the most important things for us to keep in mind?
So I couldn't catch any of the end of that, but the part that I heard most clearly was what is most important to keep in mind. For me, one of the reasons I've drawn professionally to the practice of what is called compassion-focused therapy is that there are certain I would say kind of ethical commitments built into this way of doing therapy, or that are core to me as a human being. And so when I reflect on what I think is most important the rest of this year and in the time to come, I think anything that contributes to that sense of human solidarity and real human belonging is something that will be beneficial to us as human beings. Recognizing that there are so many forces for, atomization, what we were talking about earlier. We can come up with all the reasons in the world that will make sense on a certain level for suspicion, for cynicism, for giving hope about collective action. And I also think that's particularly important for me as a person who have positions of social power and privilege is, one of the guiding things. It's that internet meme, and I'm going to butcher the exact wording of it, but I think it says something like, think of the most vulnerable person you know and vote in their interests. A commitment worth keeping beyond simply, the rest of, beyond the election. But into this year and really through a lifetime. And for me, that is so closely connected with this capacity to touch with the suffering of the world in sustainable ways. Capacity for self-compassion is so necessary. To borrow from, she teaches in the East Bay and I think in Oakland in California. Mushin Patricia Ikeda, the Buddhist teacher, she talks about working with her activists and her taking the vow not to burn out. And to me, I think that's important. And maybe this is a good place to kind of leave it as the time gets tight. But I would say the most important thing is the vow not to burn out.
And one related question to that, maybe, tell us to be gentle with ourselves during this time.
So what I heard is tips on how to be gentle with ourselves.
Yep.
I would go to a much wiser authority. The Wild Geese poem. Let this, and again, I'm going to butcher the language and apologies, but let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. I find for so many people right now, when it can feel fraught or distant, time with beloved pets, a literal soft animal, or comfortable clothes, fuzzy blankets, being gentle with ourselves, I think also means allowing ourselves to find sources of comfort that are very basic. What I love about the capacity for compassion is how very basic it really needs to be to allow us to live in sustainable ways through this time.
Thanks, Ken. I know you've got to go, and I'll stay on for a minute if you want for anybody else who's got questions, but I'm glad that you were with us. This was a great conversation. Thanks for putting up with the text.
It's all about flexibility, right? Thanks, Lee, for inviting me, and everyone else. Good to see you.
You're welcome.